Today I'm going to show you how to create fast and hypnotic techno bass lines using just the stock tools from Ableton Live. And by the way, the same process is possible in any other DAW, so whether you're using FL Studio, Logic, Cubase, doesn't really matter. You can apply the same technique and then transfer it to your DAW. So let's jump right in. My name is Philip from Pick Yourself. I produce, mix and master music full-time in my Berlin-based studio. I specialize in electronic music, especially techno. And if you currently struggle with finishing songs, I have a little gift for you. It's called the Finisher Framework. My 3 simple steps that you can use to finish music at a great sounding level consistently. This is the condensed knowledge that I've collected over the past 15 plus years and working with hundreds of artists every single year. So you can get it at pickyourself.com/framework. The link is in the description. First of all, what do we actually need if you want to create fast and hypnotic techno bass lines? Well, we just need 2 components. The synth, could be a plugin or it could be a hardware unit. And the second thing is the note information that goes into this synth. So typically with these fast rolling techno bass lines, we want to create note information that varies in pitch. So for example, an arpeggio is really good to use. Arpeggio is just a chord that is dissolved into the various notes. So an arpeggio that is playing at a really fast speed, for example, 16th notes, which is totally doable at a tempo of 136 that I have here. There are 2 ways of getting this note information into your DAW. So first of all, you could just pencil it in and just go into your piano roll and pencil in the different notes that you want in your arpeggio. And Ableton has this cool scale feature where you can actually use a scale and then it selects just the notes that you want to use. But there's actually a faster way of doing this in Ableton. In my experience, the fastest way to do this is just to first of all pencil in the root note of your chord. So let's say I want to create an E minor chord. And then we'll go to our plugins and we will select a couple of MIDI plugins. So first of all, we want to have the chord plugin, and then we want to have a arpeggiator, and next some kind of synth plugin. So typically the analog synth in Ableton Live works really well for these types of bass lines. And now let's see what we have to do with this. Like I said before, we want fast notes to be playing because right now it's sounding like this. It's not necessarily a fast arpeggio. So what do we need to do to actually get there? The first setting we need to adjust is the rate of the arpeggio. So we want to have it play at 16th notes. And then you can also change things like the gate length, how long the individual notes are playing. What is important is the style here. You can let the arpeggio play up or you can let it play down or a variation of which types of notes. Now, currently, it doesn't make any difference because we haven't defined the chord that is playing. We just have our root note and it still sounds like this. So relatively boring. But what we can do before we define the chord is we can define the sound of the synth, because otherwise we cannot really tell if the arpeggio is sounding great or not. So let's dial this in so we don't have to listen to a boring synth all the time. So here in our analog synth, we can define what the oscillators are doing. So first of all, I will define a shape here. Now, personally, I like to have a combination of something like a sine wave and then maybe something like a sawtooth wave or a square wave. If you want it to be super gritty, you can do something like sawtooth plus square, for example, would sound like this. If you want it to be sounding a little bit more mellow, you can use a combination of, for example, 2 sine waves pitched differently. So one a little bit higher, one a little bit lower. So it sounds quite boring right now, but this is just because we haven't dialed in anything else. But all of this is possible theoretically. So what we can do is we can use, for example, a sine wave together with a sawtooth wave. I will let this pitched up a little bit. And we need to adjust the filter to be a bit more plucky. You can also define how loud this is. And then adjust the filter, of course. So this is good enough as a starting point right now. We can mess with this later on to dial exactly the right setting in. Now let's take care of our actual chords so we can listen to an interesting arpeggio now. So if we are in E, we want to create, for example, an E minor chord. You can do this by using 3 semitones here and then 7 semitones here, which is like a minor third and a perfect fifth on top of our root note. So this now sounds like this. So you get an idea of what this typical hypnotic techno bassline might sound like. To be honest with you, I think you are missing out if you just restrict yourself to minor chords, major chords, like typical triads. You can do some really funky stuff here by just dial in a couple of interesting settings on the chord plugin. So what I encourage you to do is to try out a couple of additional shifts here, which just adds new notes to this chord. So for example, if I put in here 8 semitones, which is just 1 semitone more than this one, it starts to sound like this. Quite interesting. Now, if I take it to another level and, for example, add here a 4th semitone, which is just 1 more than this one here, it starts to sound really interesting. Now, the reason why this sounds so interesting and so groovy is because we are kind of creating a polyrhythm within this. We have just one bar here that's playing, and here we have the root note, but then 1, 2, 3, 4 notes on top of the root note, which is very interesting because now we have 5 notes that are playing within one bar. So depending on where this whole chord arpeggio is, it starts to shift around what is the first note and what is the last note. Now you can then combine this, for example, with really crazy random sources here. So you basically let it randomly decide what note to arpeggiate when. So it could sound like this. So you get the idea. You can create it even more diverse and make it interesting in the way that you want. I personally like to keep it in this like down arpeggio style and then maybe switch it up throughout the song. So if you come to a new part, you can then switch the setting, for example, or create a duplication of that bass line with a different setting. So these are interesting ways to work with this, but now let's talk about how we can make the sound even more interesting. So what I like to do here is to work a little bit with the LFOs that are already in the synth plugin, and most synth plugins have something like this. So for example, here we have this sine wave that we can use as LFO1. And you can then, for example, change it to the frequency modulation of the filter. So a little bit of that. And obviously you can change the rate of the LFO to be slower, so you can slowly modulate stuff. And then, for example, use the second LFO and adjust this slightly differently. So maybe a little bit faster, so they're phasing against each other. And change this, for example, to another setting of the second filter. For example, if you activate the second filter, you can also use a little bit of the resonance here and change this as a modulation source. So just to give you an example, I can map the second LFO on the second oscillator to the pitch modulation, which means like the pitch will slightly drift in accordance to this modulation source, this LFO. So this would be an extreme example, but I can do this like super subtly, like this. So this is just a tiny variation that still adds this interesting tonality to it. So it's not like a super straight chord anymore, but the pitch is slightly drifting on one of those oscillators. Personally, I like to use an autofilter on top of all of that because this gives me a lot of control over the course of the song. So I can later on automate, for example, when this bass line is appearing and when it's fading out again. Just dial in whatever you want here in terms of what the cutoff should be and how resonant it should be. And then also you can, for example, use one of these other settings to add a little bit more drive and character if you want that. I think this like MS-20 type drive works super well. And theoretically, you could also use an LFO here so that this is being automated or modulated according to the song. But to be honest with you, I like to use this more in a manual way. For example, mapping it to a controller and then playing it while the track is playing. But this just gives me an extra layer of control on top of the frequency modulation on the synth itself. One important step is still missing to create these immersive sounding fast hypnotic techno bass lines. So we have the foundation, but I'm going to show you a really interesting effects chain that you can use to pull the listener in and create this immersive sounding feeling. Before we get to that final step, I hope you learned something new, and if this is the case, then please consider subscribing, because this gives me a positive signal to keep going with these videos. I always take time out of my busy day in the studio, sacrifice time that I could use to work with my clients, to actually create free content for you so that it hopefully helps you. So that would encourage me quite a bit to keep going. Now let's move into our effects chain. So the thing that we want to set up is a send return path. So in Ableton, that's quite easy to do. Just basically send your signal here with this little knob to a return path, and then we can slap on effects here. Now, why do I not just put them on here and use a wet dry knob? You will see what happens right now, because I have a relatively complex chain of effects and I want to only send a certain part of the signal into this. Best way to do this, in my opinion, is to first of all start with an autofilter and then filter out a lot of the low end, because I don't want the low end of the bass to be fed into this effects chain. Because now we're going to continue with something like the filter delay and then a couple of other delays. I want to just be creative with this. So here the echo, for example, would be the next delay. And then I can also use something like a vocoder. So the reason I'm not super systematic with this is because I want to create an interesting texture that pulls the listener in. And when I have all these tools available, I can then jump between them and create something that just smells like creativity and is not like perfectly dialed in. So this is the type of texture that I want to create. Now, obviously, I completely removed any dry signal whatsoever, and then I can send part of this filter delay into the echo, part of this into the vocoder. So this is kind of the detail settings that I can dial in specific ways. But honestly, there is no super systematic way of doing this. I could give you a perfect effects chain here, but this is not the point here. I would even take it further, to be honest, and add something like an erosion plugin and then an LFO. So here, this like Max for Live LFO that I can then map to specific settings. So for example, here I can map it to the frequency so that this is moving slower here, a bit of an offset in the positive direction. And the same for the filter plugin. So this has a built-in LFO, of course, which is a little bit easier then. I can also use a bit more gritty filter here. Now, this starts to sound really interesting. You can then also put all of that into a reverb. And I'm also just not gonna dial in the perfect setting here. Maybe a plate reverb, so that's gonna be fine. And just a part of the signal. Now, obviously all of this is way too loud still. I would probably feed it into the mix at a lower level. So let's just feed this in slightly. And the cool thing about this is that you can later on automate all of this. So for example, the filter that is on the synth itself could be relatively closed first of all, but you have a lot of that delay effects chain set up so that it's like starting relatively washed out and spacious, and then you're gradually feeding in more of that bass line, for example, or the other way around. So all of that is something you can play with. And this is what makes the sonic storytelling of a track actually interesting. This is how you transition from one part to the next part, from, for example, a breakdown to a peak part. All of this is going to be much more interesting because now you have all of these tools available. So I hope you got something out of this. Let me know in the comments, and I hope to see you in the next video.